For great. Good morning, Nick. All right, so we're waiting on Emily, Heather, Matt, Fortunat, George, and nonetheless, I do think we'll get going. There we go. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine, and you?
Great. So yeah, let's just kick off by first saying thank you so much to Yvette, who has served this group so capably and has moved on to another position. As I mentioned in the packet outside state government, she is attending this meeting as an observer, and so and is eager to stay connected to what the group is doing and producing for products. And so thanks, Yvette, and wanted to also welcome Tom Gordon in her stead. And Tom and I work together on a lot of projects, and he'll be stepping right in and working with Ethan ultimately to frame up the report that will ultimately come out of this group's work. Good morning, Emily. And so maybe just a quick review of the agenda, but before that, wanted to just check in with the co-chairs to see if there were any remarks at all that you cared to make before we got started.
Good morning, everybody. This is Nancy McBrady. I just wanted to thank everyone for continuing to show up for these meetings. We're well into the fifth meeting now, and I just want to compliment everyone for your time and attention, and also for those working very diligently to put together these supporting documents, which are so helpful. So just wanted to note that we're still in the marathon, and just really appreciate everybody's time and commitment to this. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Nancy.
And I second that. Nothing to add. So good morning, everyone.
Right. Okay, thanks. Well, so you no doubt noticed that it was a large packet. A lot of work was done between the last meeting and this one. Really want to thank the subcommittees, particularly Caitlin and Ellen for organizing those two pieces of work, and all the others who jumped in and helped with those work products. And that really is the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today. I think the planning team, if you will, Nancy, Selena, Ethan, Tom, and I, looking at how many meetings you have remaining, sort of came to the conclusion that we're probably at the point where we should pivot, no longer be thinking about external speakers, and really, focus more now on creating the work products that come out of all that learning. If you feel strongly otherwise, that you feel like there's sort of a voice or a perspective that we haven't heard, by all means, please let us know that, and we can, try to figure out how to factor that in. But I think that you've got a lot on your plates already, and you sort of have partially produced potential end products, and so perhaps best to hone in on them and see what deeper progress you can make on them. But at any time, just cut in and let us know if you think there are other perspectives that need to be thought of. With that, we're going to start with this, the refinement to the tiers concept. I'm going to ask any one of the members of that group to walk us through the changes. And really, I think, the point of this is to see where do you want to go with this? Are there particular points in that matrix that you think should be the greatest focus of this group, and kind of adding more content to how it would be used? So we do want to have we want to end up with greater direction around that by the end of that conversation. This policy tools and research needs report is obviously new work. And my thought is that since there are so many policy tools included in that document, that it may make more sense to sort of take each one at a time and have some brief discussion about each of them, your reactions to it, the applicability that you see in Maine. Does this feel like a high priority for you with high potential, or it's got a whole bunch of landmines associated with it, and it may not be worth your effort to focus on it. So, we don't want to leave the meeting without getting a sense of your feelings about each one of those items. We'll have 2 opportunities for public comment. And then a discussion about scorecards, which is a concept that Palmer Moore from Nexamp brought up at the last meeting. And as you know, many examples of that were provided in your packet, as well as a summary of all the different factors that are included in those scorecards, to see if you think it has relevance for Maine. And then we'll wrap up with reviewing sort of where do we go from here, and is this consensus areas document still reflective of things that you agree on, so that Ethan and Tom could be taking some of your work and turning it into at least the skeleton of a draft report for you to be looking at for the next meeting, just kind of the framework of it, see if it has the right shape. And then we'll spend the following 2 meetings after that, adding the meat to it, if you will. Any questions about the agenda or things that you think are missing? Okay. All right, so then let me turn it over to the tiers concept subgroup. And Caitlin, if you want to kick it off and yeah.
Yeah, sure. If everyone wants to take a look at, I think, page 5 in the packet, it's a full page that includes the purpose statement that we originally came up with for this matrix, as well as an updated chart and some of the definitions that the small group was discussing as important to include alongside the matrix. So I'll just go over some of the points that we discussed changing, either decided to implement or not, and then anyone else can feel free to jump in with their thoughts or update from our small group definition. So the first thing that we talked about was a suggestion to include project scale in the matrix. And we ultimately ended up not including that because project scale is discussed in the policy tools list that the other working group came up with. And we thought it would just be a little redundant to include it in both, as well as this matrix is already pretty busy with information. So the project scale is not addressed in this product. The other things we talked about including that we did end up adding in were the kind of value statements on the woodlot column. So you'll see we added encourage co-location for woodlot on farms that falls under prime soils classification, as well as soils of statewide importance. And then we added encourage development for woodlot on farms that falls under marginal farmland classification. In addition, we thought it was important to acknowledge the whole big category of non-agricultural land, but understand that it's kind of outside the scope of this group to fully flesh that out and place too much value on it. So we just put a note at the bottom that kind of classifies all the different kinds of non-agricultural land, and just briefly stating that we would obviously encourage development on those types of parcels. Then we added some definitions down below. You'll see we used the definitions for co-location and dual use. Just a brief sentence from the full definitions that this group has already agreed upon. And then included definitions for the different columns of farmland. So actively farmed, inactive farmland, and other farmland that we took from our discussion about the treatment of these parcels under Maine tax law, as well as some definitions from the USDA agricultural census. And so one thing I just wanted to flag for the group that we did not make a decision on was whether cover crops specifically should be classified as active farmland or inactive farmland, due to they are classified as inactive farmland under that USDA definition, but some of us felt that it was more accurate to include cover crops specifically in the active farmland category. So would love others' thoughts on that. And just one last point, I'll just throw it all out there for you guys, is we did not include anything about blueberries on here. We felt that it is an important thing for this group to discuss and include in at least one of our work products, because blueberries are such an important part of Maine's farming community and economy, but we just didn't feel like we had the expertise to classify different types of blueberry fields or how they should be treated. So maybe something for us to discuss in the future, or pull in some information from a blueberry expert here in Maine. So that is what we discussed and added into the matrix. And anyone else in the group, please correct me if there's anything I forgot or add additional context, but happy to hear everyone's thoughts.
Thank you, Caitlin. So Eliza, Matt, Emily, Jeremy, Ellen, do you have anything that you'd like to add? And then I'll take your question, Matt. Or no, your comment. No, you go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Just since looking at the matrix and last meeting, and when we sort of focused on that last subcommittee meeting, I looked at what applications of dual use a little bit more, just commercially, like where it's been happening around the country. Pretty limited applications of that, very expensive, very, I think I refer to it as kind of boutique development. And I'm not sure it's going to work in Maine, just to be candid. I know, Caitlin, you have a project where you're co-locating with, but I would refer to it more as co-locating with blueberry. So dual use like that niche of the solar world, very expensive, very hard to do. And I know this is kind of a late breaking finding, but wanted to just talk about it a little bit as a group, because if we're encouraging dual use, and that's going to go in a policy document on inactive farmland, for example, I think that's basically just saying the farmer can't develop solar. Because I don't think dual use, I don't think we can afford dual use, like the PPA price that it would cost to fund dual use in Maine. Massachusetts, sure, big economy, a lot of ratepayers. Maine, it has 1.5 million ratepayers. We're probably not equipped to do that unless it's like, someone else is paying for it. So I think that's a change in my thinking since from last time to this time. And I just wanted to hear what other folks have to say about it.
Sure. Let me bookmark that, make sure that we come back to that. Okay. I don't want to ignore it, but I also don't want to get sort of like derailed by it either. Sure. So we'll make sure we come back to it. And if
wherever it fits,
let's make sure we do. From anyone else, including you, Matt, and the rest of the subgroup, is there anything that you want to add in terms of the content, the work that the group did? Ellen, go right ahead.
I was just going to suggest maybe, I don't know if other people read this way, but when we talk about other farmland, I would put consisting primarily of agricultural land used for crops, pasture, grazing in parentheses. Because I think the two buckets there really, right, are land that does not otherwise fall into the actively farmed category or wasteland. But I just got confused whether we were in just the way that that sentence is structured. I don't, because it's obviously not land, right, used for crops, pasture, or grazing.
I was confused by that as well. I don't know if others were, but it does strike me that grammatically it would be an improvement. Emily?
Yeah, I just want to agree with Ellen that if we can just revise the structure of that sentence, because it's the land that is not well produced or well used for those things. So it tends to be wasteland or non-crop land or non-pasture land. So yeah, I think just a editing of that sentence context and clarify that.
And so, Caitlin, do you feel like you have enough guidance on how to do that? You know, one solution is the parenthetical one. The other is to reorganize the sentence, and so it's not so prevalent. The list of types of agricultural land is not so prevalent in that, or you know, doesn't come first. Okay. This may seem a little bit tangential, but I just want to note, because I'm also facilitating the Governor's Forest Carbon Task Force concurrently, and I wondered what, if that task force were to read this matrix and to look at woodlots on farms on what would be considered marginal farmland and encouraging solar development there, you know, it's faced with a, how do we make sure that Maine's forests sequester at least as much as they currently are, and preferably more in the future. And so I think that group might, that piece of the matrix might raise concern for them, but I just wanted to flag that and see if you all had any reactions to that. I don't want to solve one problem and create a different one. Eliza, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Jody, and something that we discussed, and we're trying to make sure that we were avoiding that, and that's really valuable feedback. And so what we were trying to make sure is that the scope or the land, the piece of land that we're talking about is, you know, what is owned within the farm. This is not kind of woodlot on the whole, but what's within a farm ownership. And how do we kind of evaluate those types of land uses, or those types of, those types of land uses as they relate to each other, not as they relate to other land uses outside of the farm area. Mm-hmm. So, and, you know, I know we added, it used to just say maybe woodlot. We changed it to woodlot on farms to try to parse that out, but I'm interested in others' feedback on how we could make it more clear that we're not saying to incentivize, you know, solar on all woodlands, but when it comes to comparing, for instance, a woodlot within a farm ownership and actively farmed land within a farm ownership, that's the type of solar development you'd like to see on either of those types of land uses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Patrick, go ahead, and then Ellen.
Yeah, so while I'm certainly sympathetic to the other working group and their goals, I think that for us, we need to encourage solar development somewhere. And as far as how solar interfaces with agriculture, marginal farmland that's currently in woodlots, that seems like a good place to be encouraging it.
Thank you. Ellen, go ahead.
I don't really have a solution, but I do just want to point out that I think that it's a tricky situation, even when you're talking about just within the context of a farm, because we certainly don't want to set up a structure, right, where farmers, I mean, although obviously it would be their choice, but I mean, farmers could participate, right, in the carbon markets that are being sort of discussed, right, related to small landowners. And so, yeah, it is a tricky dynamic, because at the same time, you might want farmers to be able to take advantage of those types of markets, but obviously it's their choice whether they do solar or whether they do choose to use their woodlots that way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to offer a case-specific example. We've got a relationship with a landowner that I think they've got 1,200 acres of land, and they bought an old farm in the 1950s, and They basically have a bunch of it in some of it's prime farmland, and they actually have a tenant farm on. They've used a portion of the property for tenant farming, and then the rest of it is woodlot, and it's being managed for commercial timber. And we have a proposed project on that on the timberland, and it is prime farmland, but it is never going to be used for farming. It's very rocky. It's got trees on it, and so that seems like a pretty good example where the person bought the whole parcel, and now they have it kind of broken up into various uses that make sense. And they're looking at some aggregate, and they're trying to just, right? So when you think about kind of it's pretty hard to be a farmer. It's alone, but the economics are tough. But if you add timber and add solar and add some aggregate, and if you encourage development in that backlot area, I think we should be thinking from a farmer's perspective. I would love to hear from farmers because the economics are tough.
Yes, Nick.
Thank you. So on my farm, we're enrolled in the farmland and open space, and then of course we've had to categorize according to the current use program different aspects of our farm. The small woodlot on my farm is an important part of my farm. I wouldn't want to cut it all down to put up solar, just as much as I wouldn't want to utilize my best fields, my best producing fields for a solar farm. Instead, it's the marginal lands are at the borders. They're the shoulders, they're the edges. They're the wet, think of a golf course in the rough, the rough out of play. That's where I would want to creatively put solar in addition to existing structures on my farm. Roof mounted, we have barns, like a lot of agricultural properties. The problem is a lot of those are difficult to get to. They are out of play on the property for a reason. They are maybe hard to get to, or they are part of a drainage. They end up sort of occupying that marginal category for good reasons. And farmers before me have treated them that way. So they're pretty scrubby and shrubby and et cetera, et cetera. So I've looked anew at my property with this, as part of this process and saying, could you develop something there or there? And they are inevitably not easily accessed. And I can't see that they would appeal to a developer. They may be neat and tidy. They may be the most sort of creative and thoughtful way to holistically incorporate solar into my property, but they're the hardest to get to. And so I think it's fine to talk about sort of continually pushing to all of these rough, out of play, previously developed, and then you get to landfill caps and brownfields and all these other, they sort of fall into that same category. I think it's good to simultaneously be mindful that sometimes those are just really difficult to access and thus difficult to develop, even with the best intentions. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. George.
So I just wanted to note that brownfields and landfills often do have quite a bit of infrastructure built into them already. So I totally understand what Nick's getting at with marginal areas on a farm, or the back 40 at an orchard or something like that. But brownfields tend to be relatively accessible. So I think I would not categorize them. I would not put them in the same basket as side areas in a farm.
So does anyone have difficulty with this added element to the matrix, that bottom line of the list of things to encourage, even with the points that Nick and George have just made? Would you prefer to have that modified in some manner?
Which line are you referring to? Woodlots on farms or other?
No,
farms?
sorry, bottom row, not column, bottom row that is now non-agricultural land. Are you saying it where it says encourage development on landfills, brownfields, rooftops, carports, etc.? Selena, while you're not seeing it.
When I was looking at it, I was thinking about fields that are not marginal farmland, but are not landfills, brownfields. I feel like there is a group of land that fits between those two, and whether that was something that the group contemplated, and other greenfields that aren't categorized as marginal farmland, and whether those fit into non-agricultural land as well in the definition down below.
Any reactions to that from the group? While y'all think about it, George, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the production history of land is really the key. You know, if you look at these side areas in a farm, you know, as Nick is saying, you know, there's a lot of fields in New England that are really great at producing rocks, but not so great for crops. And so, you know, that might be a criteria that you could use, which is, you know, has this land been in productive use for you know, food productive for a food crop, to include maybe even a feed crop as well, in the last 20 or 30 years. And if the answer to that is no, you know, no, this particular parcel or this particular area has not produced food, not produced feed of any kind in the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, whatever, even though technically the soil conditions are prime farmland, that looks like that would sound like a pretty good spot to put solar to me on a farm that's going to help support an area where they are producing feed and food. You know, and I think that's maybe one of the things that we're stuck with is if you judge soil conditions, you're going to get one answer, but if you look at the actual productive history of a farm and specific areas, you might get a different answer.
Emily, and then Matt.
I think that the sort of greenfield open space that's not farmland is certainly a conversation to be had, but I almost feel like it's also, if it's not classified as farmland, there are still lots of uses for it, but I don't know that I would want to be the one commenting on, you know, a field that might have ecological value that's not necessarily farmland. So I wonder if it's really just a note here around non-prime, non-farmland, not on, you know, not classified in farmland as any way, that's an open space, that's a green field, is, you know, just a set of category that would be very far outside, for me, outside of this conversation. If it's not prime and it's not on a farm and it hasn't been used historically as farmland, I feel like if I were to comment on that, I would be unqualified in terms of like ecological issues or whatnot. So I'm just thinking that it's a little bit like commenting on, I would say, forest land, if we wanted to go past woodlots on farms, just to forests that aren't on farms. I feel like that's outside of my sort of scope on in this particular area.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Did I miss, was it Matt that you had your hand?
I did. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we're trying to kind of make decisions for farmers here, which concerns me a little bit off of George's comments. I mean, I would hate for a farmer not to be able to use some portion of the property that they find economic. They're going to have to, you know, the developer's going to have to go through permitting to address all of these considerations anyway. And any responsible developer is going to look at habitat and all these other, right? They're going to do that voluntarily. They're also going to do it as part of NRPA, PBR. I guess my concern is like we're drifting, the group feels like it's drifting into sort of taking tools out of the farmer's pocket to make money and survive and not sell the farm for houses. You know, I'm concerned that we're potentially creating a threat to farms that doesn't exist today by taking an economic tool out of their pockets, and that's concerning to me.
Let me take the three hands up and then suggest a path forward. Ellen, and then, no, I'm sorry, it was Nick, and then Ellen, and then Eliza, I believe.
Okay, thanks. I'm just coming back around to your question, Jody. I'm the last portion of the non-agricultural land. I'm thrown off by rooftops, carports. Within that, I'm looking at as land. So and I'm looking at part of our discussion around land use. So I'm a little thrown off, and by that inclusion of carports, rooftops among the landfills, brownfields, gravel pits, mining sites, etc. I may be reading into that too deeply, but to answer your question that was a while back now, that's my feeling on if there were an edit to that section, I would just continue to focus on the land base use or use of the land for that section. That's all. Although I agree with the idea of some of what's there. It's just a little confusing is my point.
Sure. Yep, that makes sense. Okay. Then Ellen, and then Eliza.
Yeah, I think what's hard, I hear Matt's concern. I think what's hard is that really this matrix is very much tied to the piece that we're about to go over, right? Which is sort of the tools, because those tools are sort of going to be guided by these categorizations. And so it's not, and none of the tools we really talked about were sort of outright bans on certain categories of land or anything. It's just sort of government support kind of guiding development. And so, I mean, as you said, I mean, ultimately, right, it's the farmer and the developer who get to decide what works. But in terms of regulatory efficiencies or, you know, different incentives that we provide, whatever we're talking about, it's really sort of making sure that we're directing the tools in the ways that sort of align with the categories that we outlined here.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Eliza.
Ellen shared what I was about to say, that I think that it's, this is a really tough one. This matrix is a tough one to swallow as a singular document, and that it is a set of ideals. Really what it comes down to is to practice and creating, you know, I love Matt's example of the landowner and, you know, the entirety of that parcel. You know, how can we, you know, this matrix kind of sets out, you know, what's in an ideal world, where would solar be placed within that parcel? And then I think the next conversation is, how do we use regulatory mechanisms or policy mechanisms to increase the amount of choices that are available to farmers and developers?
Thank you. Jeremy.
Yeah, probably not terribly surprising to everybody. I just kind of want to echo what Matt was saying. When I read these types of reports, I think oftentimes the most value or the most significance is not in the things that it does say, but in the things that it doesn't say. So for example, we're saying, and Jody, you may push me and say, we'll talk about that in the next section, but I just feel like I need to weigh in now and say it anyway. But, you know, we have encourage dual use, encourage non-dual use elsewhere. I mean, both of those might seem relatively inconsequential, but where I see that migrating and to become an area of concern for industry is finding their way into permitting decisions, whether it's municipal permitting decisions or DEP, LUPC, to use that as a potential justification to deny projects. So in other words, well, we're actually trying to encourage the dual use here, and you're not a dual use project, so therefore we're leaning toward denial. That's where I think we start to see the real world impact of sort of soft language, ideals, encouragements, but the counter to that is a discouragement. And if that's what we end up doing as part of this, that's where I get really concerned about the direction of this language.
Thank you. So let me suggest a couple of things. Let me try to summarize what I think I've heard so far in terms of some concrete changes, and see if you all are comfortable with them. The first is to rework the definition of other farmland so that it's clearer. The second is to potentially remove rooftops and carports from that row, speaking to non-agricultural land. The third is to not add a category that talks about greenfields and open space because it's sort of out a little bit too far outside the scope of this group. The fourth is to maybe that was it. I think that was it in the specifics. I do think it's important. I think Ellen is making an important point here that it is difficult to speak of these things in the abstract, and that we may want to move on to the next agenda item and then come back to this agenda item and see sort of what the real world impact could be on various categories if this group strongly wants to pursue X policy approach. What I think could be helpful before we move on to that discussion is to get a little bit clearer understanding of these, I'm going to call them 12 categories. There's, if you look at, there's essentially 12 ways in which the rows and the columns intersect. Are there particular areas of greatest importance to you, concern to you, where you want to make sure that as you're pursuing policy initiatives, you're honing in on, positively impacting some of these areas, and you're somewhat less concerned about others? I don't know if that's the right approach to this, but it's just a suggestion. Think on that while I take Matt.
I think that's the spirit of my comments. Like when you just keep it simple, the mission, I think initially was to directionally, and this is maybe a little bit to Ellen's comment, directionally you want to support policies that protect active farmland. But I think ultimately when we start talking about specifically like dual use, for example, I don't think that belongs in here, to be honest, because that's a technology that we can't afford in this state. And so like that's a good example of where is like what feel like policy, high level policy directional indicators. Now we're getting way into the specifics. And so I feel like if we want to have policy principles, they should be just that like really high level. Those are my thoughts on the matrix. It might be just a little bit too weedy, and everybody that I've kind of talked with, even in this group, is wondering, we're always wondering, how is this going to be used? And it does raise concern, because if we're not careful, it could be used in ways that none of us likes.
Thank you. I think it was George and then Nick. Do I have that in the right order? No, Nick and then George. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree with the comment from Ellen that it's difficult to dig into some of this or formulate some guidance in the abstract. And I want to come back to something that Jody, you brought up at the very beginning. And you said at any time somebody could come back in and say, hey, if you think there are other perspectives that are missing from this process that still need to be considered. I think what's been missing from this process is to hear from a specific farmer or group of farmers that are actually engaged in dual use activities on a site. We've seen studies. I mean, we've seen examples. I mean, I myself have tried to forward some information. There's only one person that's doing this in the state of Maine, and I know separately, I would go as far to say somewhat unfortunately separately from this process, there's been some work around dual use and solar on the ground here in Maine, that I think we could have melded some of that or combined some of that to hear from some of those folks that are boots on the ground trying to get this going here in Maine. There are also resources nationally that are outside of Maine, but where we could have heard from, and maybe still can, not sure, voices on the ground. I don't want to discredit some of the remarkable depth and breadth of knowledge. Folks that may not be currently boots on the ground, but have been in the past or been engaged in research or employment doing so.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I'm not through if I might have a moment, please.
Sorry.
Not to grandstand, but I don't quite understand enough of Matt's comment about Maine not being able to understand dual use. I want to push back against that because my gut is I don't see how we can afford not to, but I'm sympathetic to, I'm not sure. I think we're fumbling that ball at the moment. I do agree with that, but I don't want to give up on that. And I don't quite understand, admittedly, all of Matt's comments on we can't afford it. So I want to understand that because I want to promote dual use. The last thing I will say is developers don't breathe life into these sites. They can design and they can be encouraged to design, but farmers breathe life into the sites. So dual use, the actual use, the actual activity that has to be encouraged can be in part facilitated by development, can be in part facilitated or directed by policy, but you need to do something to breathe life, the actual action into the sites. And a lot of talk about dual use this and dual use that. It's kind of pipe dreaming until something gets to that action point.
Thank you. Deep breath here. No, very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to take George, and then truly, I am going to make a suggestion that moves us on. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, so I think dual use is really important. I think some of the proposals that are in the matrix that are the most substantive and the most likely to really affect industry are surrounding dual use. I also think that given the changes to federal incentives that are coming down the road, that the economics of dual use projects appear very likely to change substantially within the next 2 to 10 years. So I think the economic argument or the issue with ratepayers and offtake and stuff like that, I think it's valid in the current market, but I am very concerned that it is not valid in the very near term. So Matt, speaking to your thinking, I appreciate that you're saying that you would prefer not to have regulatory guidance pointing in one direction or the other, but I think that we run the risk of a pretty big missed opportunity if we don't find a way to support this. The other piece of that is I think this group is fundamentally always has been about supporting farmers. And I think one of my key pieces of input to the subcommittee, and I'm happy to say it right now, is that I think that if there's going to be ratepayer support for a particular mode or a particular application of the technology, I think dual use agrivoltaics are the one application of solar, which I think is likely politically viable, okay, for ratepayer support. And that's politically viable on a bipartisan or even a nonpartisan basis. Nobody is going to look at agrivoltaics and say, I don't want to support family farms in Maine and putting solar in conjunction with farming use, active farming use. So I think that actually dual use policy coming out of this group may actually be the single most important thing that we do. And that would be my reluctance to deleting it or otherwise omitting discussion of it. And I'm Matt and Jeremy both, I'm deeply aware that changes to the interconnection queue or other changes and incentives have the potential to affect industry and have the potential to affect opportunities you've already lined up. But I think that the technology is very, very close. And I'm very concerned that federal incentives coming would make these projects viable, and we won't have the right supports in place to help you guys capitalize on that.
Thank you. because I'm going to stick to what I said, I'm going to ignore your hand for a moment, Matt, and appreciate that you'll raise it again for the next conversation, because the two relate so much. So I do that somewhat reluctantly, but I want to point you all for a moment back to this chat. If you dial back to the chat, a couple numbers. One is Pat's suggestion that we not remove carports and rooftops, but instead change the heading to potentially include it. Thumbs up or thumbs down on that one? Could I just see so that we could move on from that fairly quickly? Y'all seeing it? Okay, I'm seeing basically thumbs up. Caitlin, do you mind, sort of tracking this so that you're tracking these changes? And then I'm going to point you 2 comments down to Emily about the note about cover crops. And I think folks are agreeing largely. Anybody disagree with Emily's take on how we handle cover crops? Even though it's, let's see, even though it's inconsistent with the USDA definition, is that what it is? Okay, so we'll make that clarification in the matrix as well. Okay. Anybody object to the idea of having a speaker at the next meeting that can speak to dual use, both from a very practical standpoint? They have experience doing it. They can speak to the practicality of it and the cost effectiveness or cost challenges associated with it. Anybody think that's not a good idea? Okay. All right, then we'll do our best. And Eliza, I'll take you in just one second. Nick or anybody else, if you have specific individuals that you could point us to that you think might be good to present to the group, that would be very helpful. Eliza, go ahead.
I, of course, have no objection to having someone come and talk about dual use, but I do think it will be important to, when we identify that person, should it not be someone from Maine, and I expect it might not be, that we include in the conversation, what Matt addressed and what I think is really important for this group to consider, that Maine has a specific, ratepayer situation, that while something might work in another state, it might not. There are circumstances that are unique to Maine. That doesn't mean something is equally transferable to the state. So just to make sure that we kind of balance that conversation a little bit, because the economic factors are really important.
Okay. Yep, makes sense. All right, may I suggest that we move on to the next agenda item, that we start digging into the specific policy ideas, and that if we need to circle back, and we very well may need to, at the end of that, to this matrix to see, what is its relevance, we can do that. Any problems with that? Selena.
I just want to, I recognize that we're going to have someone come talk about dual use so we understand it more, but so just want to understand what we're doing with Matt's previous comment about our dual use and whether we should be emphasizing that in all of this. So how do you see that fitting into delving into the policy pieces without having that conversation yet about whether it's the right, whether we have enough information to make a judgment call whether dual use is the answer for Maine, and how you see those two pieces fitting together as we delve into the policy? Are we going to talk about it without focusing on dual use and just the policy lever itself, or just curious how you want to manage that?
Yeah, so my suggestion, but I'm certainly open to all of your good ideas as well, is basically we have a conversation with a big fat caveat, which is, acknowledging that we don't know what we don't know yet. We're going to hear more about it. We can talk about these policy tools, essentially somewhat in abstract, to see if they appear to make sense to you all or they don't. And then leave final judgments around them until that we essentially circle back to these policy tools after we've heard further about dual use. That's the best I've got at the moment. Other thoughts about it? Other ideas on how to do it more efficiently? What I don't think would be a good idea is to sort of hold off and not talk about these policy tools for another meeting until we hear more on dual use. Because, to be candid, you have received a fair amount of written information about dual use. You've not received, to all of your points, enough information about, is it financially viable? And what are some of the challenges of doing it and so on. So I don't want to pretend that we know nothing, that you know nothing. So that would be my suggestion. Do you have concerns about that, Selena? I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think that that's okay. What I have been thinking over the last couple of meetings is that while I see dual use being in some ways seen as the best, however you want to characterize it, but the highest level. But I also have heard from different speakers about the importance of pilot programs to understand from a scientific and from a farm perspective about what it actually looks like and means, and whether the benefits of dual use warrant ratepayer funding to support that, or whether we should really be focusing on those marginal farmlands that Nick mentioned. And that's a better use of Maine people's money and resources. And so to me, it seems like pilot program or real world experience makes the most sense prior to making large scale kind of across the board endorsement of dual use as a state in all these policy areas. But that's just my personal state at this juncture. So happy to hear other people's perspectives. So in terms of the direction of the meeting, makes sense. But I think that it does make sense to add some caveat language into the notes and description and future kind of materials created to say that this is an ongoing conversation, and to have space for that conversation throughout this meeting and the next meeting as necessary.
Matt, are you, Nick and Matt, both reacting to Selena's point? Sort of responding to her point? Is that what you hope? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nick. You're first.
Oh, okay. Actually, I was a little bit more reacting to Eliza's comment. There are only a few folks that are, just getting into dual use enterprises here in Maine. So, as I said in the chat, there is an individual that I believe that Nancy and the department and DEP have been working with that is actively grazing solar in Maine, and we could probably hear from him. I know that he would like to contribute his voice to this. But then there are a number of grazers in Massachusetts. The only other thing I would say is that Matt and some other folks have commented, this is still very new. I mean, there are research studies going on. There are feasibility studies going on. I know one that's coming out in November, but it's still relatively new. So I think it's smart to think of pilot programs. I think it's smart to think of how might we encourage this, but I think it would be a mistake not to want to include it because we don't know enough about it now. So,
yeah, got it. Okay, so and I'll take you, Matt, in just 1 second, I promise. I am wondering then, and we don't need to make this decision obviously for 2 or 3 months yet, as to whether you want to think about modifying the way in which you describe, modifying the way that you reference dual use in this matrix that better acknowledges the nascent nature of this technology. So I think I just want to put that as a placeholder possibility, particularly for that subgroup to consider as you're making these other modifications. I don't think we need to make a firm decision about that right now because you've got a couple of meetings left, but you're going to be making modifications to this anyway between now and the next meeting, and you could consider adding some caveat language about the evolving nature of dual use. Matt, and then Emily, and then we are, I promise, going to move on to the policy conversation.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I didn't want to give the impression that I want the world to work the way you're some folks are describing, and Selena, I appreciate the ratepayer impact point. That's the point that I really want to just try to capture here, is that if we don't consider that and we just are looking at dual use alone, we're just going to get crushed, right? Like there is not strong support in certain parts of the legislature for increased costs. So that's the point I'm just trying to make, is that I think we should sorry about that. I think we should be aspirational in the group, but I also want to acknowledge that not everybody can pay their power bill today as it stands. So we should be mindful.
Okay. Yep. Emily.
I appreciate that point, because I do think that the adder and the potential rate and any potential ratepayer impact is a large concern. And so I just wonder if in a caveat, in a sort of adjustment of how we want to discuss dual use, if it isn't also important for us to make the note that regional research on dual use, like not just, Massachusetts is a different climate and a different terrain and different agricultural community than Maine. So, if there isn't a way that we should also be reinforcing that it's important for there to be financial support for this research. Cornell is doing it for New York, Rutgers is looking at it for New Jersey, UMass is looking at it for Maine, because it is so sort of place specific. And it isn't across the board proven. There's a lot of more work in Europe where there's a lot different types of agriculture. Again, I think it's important to make the note that while yes, we don't have a huge plethora of research data, this is an opportunity to not only try to make sure that door remains open and at least not shut it off so it becomes an impossibility, but also encourage the investigation of this for Maine on the ground and really try to make sure we can have the projects, whether they're research-based through, state universities or what, but this is an opportunity to say, we need more information here for Maine to make sure it works here, because we might have some regional anecdotes that do look good. And I'm pro dual use. I'm not trying to, but I'm saying, like, I think that if we could get some movement towards looking into the possibility here and trying to get that data to prove that it works, that's something that has a lot of potential here. And another piece of that research that isn't spoken of is actually changes in the efficiency of the panels based on spacing and raising and changing of the temperatures. So there's more than just can we produce food and solar energy, but can we produce food, and perhaps are there ways that we can increase the production of solar energy, and so that the cost isn't all just extra infrastructure. There's actually some added production, and so there's some way to mediate these costs, I think. But without the research, it's going to be difficult to get those numbers.
Heard. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Very helpful conversation. I think a necessary one. Let us move on, if we may, to pages 7 through, I don't know what, pages 7 through 17. And I'm going to turn it over to Ellen first, or and then anyone else in that group, Eliza, Caitlin, Emily, and George, apparently not Patrick. And for you to sort of introduce the concept as a whole, if you would. And then my suggestion, as I mentioned at the beginning, would be that we kind of take these one at a time and get reactions or feedback to each one, because I think it's going to be too much of a mess to try to do it at the end. If you all think differently, please weigh in, and happy to do it however you think would be best.
All right. So our subgroup basically looked at the different sort of mechanisms that had been presented to us either through actual presenters during our meetings or through the materials that we were provided prior to the meetings. And then for each of those tools that we sort of covered during through the materials or through our discussions, we basically we provided a brief description of what that tool was, how it functioned within those other state examples. And then we sort of analyzed how we thought that tool might be used to encourage dual use, to encourage co-location. We also included some thoughts as to how those tools related to some of the categorizations that Caitlin included, or that all of us involved in the project that Caitlin was managing around those land use categories, how the tools intersected with those categories in that Caitlin's matrix. And then we also put some thoughts about whether there were any project size factors that might affect the application of the tool, and whether it sort of mattered, whether the tool might be better for a certain certain scale of a project as opposed to others. We also included our sort of best guess about how, if we liked this tool as a group and wanted to move forward with it, how it would need to be implemented. Is it really just a regulatory change? Is it administrative action? Is it a legislative change? That sort of thing. And then we also tried to identify areas of research that would need to be done to assess whether the tool could be used in Maine, and whether we thought, it may be that we feel like there is enough information out there that we don't need to conduct further research. But for some tools, we did feel like some economic analyses and some other types of research might need to be done to really be able to determine if this was a good fit for Maine. So those were that's sort of a general overview, but I certainly welcome other members of the group to chime in if I've left anything out, or if they want to make some other comments.
Sounds like you covered it. That's great. So then do you want to dig into the first one? And let me just do a spoiler alert. What I think I am going to ask all of you to do at the end of this whole block of conversation is to put in the chat, if you had to pursue, three policy concepts, but you couldn't pursue more than three, what would be the three that sort of resonate for you the most, that you think this group should be kind of fleshing out further, thinking about further? It's not sort of a wholesale endorsement. It's just like, I like this idea. I think we should talk about it more. I'm going to ask you to put those 3 lines into the chat at the end. So do you want to cover permit by rule first? And yeah, Ellen, I would say maybe to walk us through that, and you'll see that there was a note that Jeremy made about a suggested wording change.
So I might suggest that the way that our group worked is we sort of divvied up the tools. So maybe the person who covered that tool might be the best person to sort of walk us through, which I think for permit by rule was Eliza, if that works.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So this group heard a presentation from Nick Levisay about a permit by rule, that possibility that the DEP is already pursuing. We also saw something somewhat similar in Vermont related to their certificate of public good, though it's important to really make a distinction that those are not the same thing, but there are similar themes in Vermont's certificate of public good. I saw Jeremy's comment, that's an important wording change, but for those who are not familiar, permit by rules are a way of streamlining the permitting process. It can be really attractive, in particular to those seeking a permit, but could also be a way for a regulatory entity to signal some preferences that they would like to see as far as the type of project, and I'm talking kind of broadly, projects, not necessarily solar, that they would like to see. As far as the 2 types of solar development, dual use and co-location, there could be within that PBR mechanism a preference for those projects, as in a project would be more likely to be streamlined if it had a dual use or a co-location project. Similarly, when it comes to land use considerations, as in solar development in a particular location, so not necessarily having anything to do with the type of development, but the location of development, that is something that could be fairly easily included within a PBR, and something that, though I only listened to a portion of Nick Livesey's presentation, I suspect that that's something that they're already contemplating including in this particular rulemaking. And then finally, as far as size considerations, so this would be a permit by rule that is related to site law. And it seems to me, and again, this is within DEP's purview and not mine. This is more me opining that the PBR would be utilized for projects slightly above 20 acres. Right now, 20 acres is, there's some nuance to it, but 20 acres is the threshold for site law. And it'd be used maybe for projects, up to 50 acres, something like that, generally speaking. And again, this is, based on conversations I've had with the DEP. Once you get kind of bigger than that, really a thorough site law analysis is what is appropriate. And it might not be a best fit for PBR.
Great.
And maybe I'll make one little editorial note based on our conversation earlier about economic considerations. A PBR on its own is not going to overcome the economic challenges of a dual use project. So I encourage folks, as they think about Jody's question about, naming the projects that are the tools that might be the best fit. In my opinion, and I think I'm taking advantage of my soapbox here, rarely is it one thing that can help move the needle. It's a combination of a couple different tools.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Anything else that the subgroup wants to add to that? And please chime in. Otherwise, I just want to get, like general reactions from all of you about this tool. Your level of interest and excitement about it, your concerns about it. Yeah, let me just open it up, and we're going to do this for each one of these, try and be somewhat brief about it because there are a lot of tools.
Should we just chime in?
Yeah.
Or in the chat? Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I think it's great. It's a great tool. Just got to be like, I appreciate like George's comment about the federal incentives. Like, we don't know where the cost things are going, so let's give developers a little bit more of the ability to kind of, like, for example, we went tracker technology. Everybody else went fixed tilt. That meant the difference between a 20-acre project and a 50-acre project. The impacts were actually less for us because we were able to lower wetland impacts by avoiding. We just had a bigger palette to paint on, and so we could move panels around to kind of accommodate like the things Nick was talking about, like backland. Okay, well, we'll try to get the driest bit of that, and then we'll try. You're kind of like building the perfect project, but having 50 acres to work with as opposed to jamming kind of panels into 20 to get the PBR, which a lot of developers did just to get the speed element. They just jammed in panels as much as they could. They'd take whatever wetland impacts. They just didn't, it kind of motivated the wrong behavior in some ways, drove the wrong behavior with a PBR that kind of steers things in the way we're talking about. I would prefer it not be dual use explicitly, but if there was some consideration of the matrix value, elements in PBR, I think having an ag provision in the PBR stuff that's on the table would be good.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? If they're minor wording changes, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, any other thoughts about this before we move on to the next one? mean, I was hearing early on, I will say that I was hearing certainly from all of the solar developers and perhaps the rest of you, that this was a tool that you thought highly of. And I'm not sure whether the more you learn, the less enamored you are with it, but I'm not entirely sure if the rest of you are as enthusiastic about it. You'll let us know in the chat at the end when you make some preliminary choices of thoughts. All right, then let's move on to the PUC evaluation / scoring process. Who covered that one? Who drafted that one?
That's Eliza again.
Okay, Eliza, why don't you go ahead?
So I'll take the PUC evaluation and also the the next one, because they're very similar at the same time. So this one is not dissimilar to a PBR. Well, scratch that. I don't want to confuse people. So when the Public Utilities Commission is in a position to choose projects, whether through RFP or some type of procurement, there could be similar to New York State siting scorecard, or similar to what was Maine's unsuccessful initial distributed generation procurement, could score projects or evaluate projects with many of the considerations that we've discussed as a group in mind. So there could be scoring that favored dual use projects, that favored co-location projects, or favored projects that are located in particular areas. Again, this is a place where the details really matter, how the scoring is weighted in favor of all of those things. And often in PUC, in RFPs, siting considerations are not the only scoring criteria. Economic considerations, workforce development, things like that are also considered, along with the things that are being contemplated by this group. We talked specifically related to dual use, particularly dual use, a little bit co-location as well, though I think co-location doesn't need quite the oomph that that dual use does. One way to make sure that dual use projects happen, or a particular type of project happens, is by saying there's, similar to Massachusetts SMART program, that there is a tranche that is, or a specific allocation for a specific type of project. So the state or the PUC saying, we want X amount of dual use projects, and we will evaluate bids for a specific type of project as one manner to kind of give a boost to a particular type of development, and similarly to development in a particular area.
That's great. Thoughts on both of those?
Just a quick thought on that, just the PUC tends not to get into these really specific sightings. So, I mean, like if past is precedent, I guess, they tend not to get into this level of detail. It's usually just price. At least on the wholesale, the wholesale side. The DG side, not so much, right? It's like price plus.
Right. Selena, go ahead.
Sorry. To Matt's point, and I think if people decide that this is an area that they want to focus on, we could consider the mechanism to do that, and whether it belongs as a recommendation to the solar DG group that is being launched to help contemplate how to shape future programs, which may or may not be the right place for this, but so it can be looked at in context of other adders or areas of focus for the solar program. So whether it's to the legislature or the PUC or the ag group, something that we can decide if it's an area that the group wants to focus on.
Yeah, great. Okay, should we move on, or any other thoughts on those two? Okay,
maybe just a quick note, just an agreement with Matt that, you know, traditionally DG has been a better fit for this, and I think that for larger scale projects, it would be very difficult for it to be a good fit for dual use and co-location. But some of the other broader land use considerations, I would argue it could be a good fit for grid scale procurements. Even though it's something that the PUC traditionally has not done, I'm excited by the precedent that was set in the past DG procurement, where the PUC had good communication with DACF and DEP. And I'm excited about the potential for there to be a little bit more communication there, but it's something new.
Okay. Then let's move on to interconnection. Who researched that one?
That's me, Caitlin. Happy to talk about this. It's a complicated one, and I'll just say with the caveat that in the columns of kind of what's needed to implement, you'll see there's a lot of steps that would be needed to understand if the economics of these tools would work, if they would work within the existing interconnection tariffs, and then we'd need a lot of further steps to actually make those happen. So just understanding that some of these are complicated and would have a long process to get implemented in Maine. But we did want to throw some ideas out there with that being understood that interconnection is one of the main barriers to development, not just in Maine, but in the country. So we wanted to just throw some ideas out there of what would lower the barrier of interconnection for projects and be able to use those lower barriers to encourage different types of siting. So the first idea that we have on here is just requiring utilities to provide more detailed hosting capacity maps, as well as some sort of analysis on their end for, you know, what areas, what substations would be better for development or are perhaps overloaded at the moment. And you'll see this could be used in several of the categories to kind of indicate to developers where development may be easier or harder based on interconnection. Just having a little bit more information from that perspective that could be used to drive development in certain areas. Specifically, this could be useful if there are points where the transmission system is really under stress, and we can indicate that kind of before projects are getting proposed. That can help mitigate siting of, you know, many larger projects in one area by indicating that, you know, that area is already under stress from an interconnection perspective. The second idea is to have a set aside of capacity at specific substations to basically reserve that capacity for projects that have the siting considerations that we would want to see. This is a complicated idea, but essentially we would basically reserve a certain amount of capacity within the substation before an upgrade would be needed, so that, you know, at the risk of losing that capacity, if it's not filled up, it would make sure that the projects that we would want to see from a siting perspective, either by size of project or by characteristic like dual use or co-location, it would basically ensure that those projects have enough capacity to interconnect without having to pay for, you know, very expensive upgrades at the substation level. Just moving on to the third one, and feel free to ask any questions about these. We kind of thought about this in terms of a mitigation fund. So that's another tool that we'll talk about later, but specifically for interconnection, understanding that if there was some sort of funding mechanism at the state level to pay for specific substation upgrades or three-phase power in specific like rural locations, it would help lower the barriers to entry for certain farms or projects that we want to see in those locations that otherwise would be financially unfeasible due to the higher interconnection costs at that location. So I know I threw a lot at you. I saw Jeremy already has his hand up, so happy to get into the discussion.
Go ahead, Jeremy. Thank you so much, Caitlin. It is a complicated area.
Yeah, thanks. Number one, I think is great. This is something that I've sort of a soapbox I've been on for the last couple of years in just about every venue, energy working group, climate council, anywhere. It is a challenging issue. I've talked about it with both of our investor-owned utilities. I think that they're definitely willing to have that conversation. It quickly becomes a discussion about public safety issues, what they call CEII, Critical Energy Infrastructure Information. Basically, you don't want to just put absolutely every detail about your system out there, because people who would seek to do you harm could really hamstring your economy and make all kinds of dangerous situations become real pretty quickly. But I like that one a lot. So I think that's good. I think it's good to send signals to the marketplace about where they should be developing projects. I think that's one of the problems we've had for the last year or so, is we have a whole bunch of projects that are trying to tie into a couple of substations. When most substations can take 15, 20 megawatts, we have interconnection requests that are in 60, 80, 100 megawatts. Those projects are never going to get built. It's frankly a waste of regulatory agencies' time. It's a waste of utilities' time to be reviewing these projects if those substations have no ability to host those projects. As for number 2 and 3, I have a lot of concern about this. This is really complicated, as I think Caitlin correctly pointed out. When you start talking about set-asides of specific amounts of capacity on substations, you can come up with 100 different priorities as to why we should do this one versus that one. There's been ongoing conversations that have not really been finally determined for the last 4 years, I believe, just in terms of having a conversation around, hey, shouldn't we create some additional capacity on certain substations so that Jane or John Doe who wants to put solar on their garage, they've got enough room on that, versus a larger developer who wants to put a 4.99 megawatt project in a field. And even that which would think would be relatively simple. Oh, great, let's make it so that Jane can put that on her garage, no problem. That hasn't been easy. And we're, again, year 4 and that's not resolved. Mm-hmm. The third one is probably just as complicated as the second one, but in a different way. I think it depends what you're using the funding for, who's paying into it, how much. And then, the worry I have, Caitlin, about that one in particular is I hear what you're saying. You create a fund so that you create an outcome so that hopefully a dual use project doesn't have to fund a large upgrade. Well, but that means somebody else is. So then you get into the equity fairness argument. Why should so-and-so have to pay for such and such? I think it's a better conversation, probably something that I think industry is moving toward generally right now, is having those conversations about how do we socialize these costs. So for folks who don't know, the way solar works now is Acme Corp proposes a project. If you are the so-called triggering project, meaning your project creates the need for an upgrade, suddenly you have to pay hundreds of thousands or any number of millions of dollars. So there's been industry conversations in Maine and elsewhere about saying, hey, probably makes sense for not just the one project to pay for that. It might make sense for the 2 or 3 preceding projects and the 2 or 3 projects that come after them to all pool together and pay for that. But that is a very complicated conversation, and it just feels like it's far outside the area where this group should get into for particularly numbers 2 and 3. So there's my minor comment.
Super, super helpful. other thoughts on this one that, you know, build off of or are different than what all the issues that Jeremy just raised? George, and then Eliza.
So I think on this particular, this is I think a really important part of the potential policy matrix. I do think that as opposed to necessarily a set aside, I think the approach really maybe should be something along the lines of prioritizing or allocation. So if somebody does walk in or submit for interconnection, if there are projects that have capacity that's already been allocated, but the projects themselves haven't executed, you know, if you have a dual use project that comes in and says, we are looking for capacity and we're prepared to execute immediately, or whatever that is, you know, that to me should be something that, you know, they should be able to go to the front of the line, quite honestly. And I realize from the industry side that, you know, it might make our interconnection queue look unreliable, but we've got a bunch of junk, to be quite frank, sitting in the interconnection queues that, you know, that is, you know, in some cases holding down capacity where people aren't going to execute projects. So what I don't like seeing is a public resource, which is our electrical utility, tied up by projects that aren't going to execute. So if somebody comes in with a project that's ready to execute and it happens to meet certain policy goals, I think they ought to go to the front of the line, and I think somebody else ought to get pushed out. And you know, that's I think the most fundamental thing. I agree that set asides create problems, but if we have projects that haven't executed and they're holding up a public utility capacity on our common carrier electrical substations, there is, you know, and somebody's been sitting on that allocation and they haven't executed, they should be out.
Okay.
And I think that's the most important thing.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Eliza.
Just quickly to say that I absolutely agree with everything that George said too, but I raised my my hand in response to Jeremy, and I think he obviously brings up really important points. And my only kind of pushback would be that while what is outlined in this, you know, 1, 2, and 3 as particular policy tools might not be the right fit, to just us to kind of bookmark interconnection as a place where there is some problem solving happen, right? There's major problems, there's problem solving happening, and it could be that what we're trying to, that we could create solutions that address both the problems that are happening in the interconnection stakeholder group that are happening here as well. You know, similar to the distributed generation conversation that'll start up soon, that though I think we're all appropriately grouped, it's important to recognize that there's a lot of potential for overlap amongst these different conversations.
Okay, all right, that's great. In the interest of time, let's move on to the next one, and who covered strengthen local planning capacity? Who did the research on that one?
I think that's Eliza's last one. Is that right, Eliza? Yours, unfortunately, all fell in the beginning.
Sorry, everybody, I'll shut up soon. So this is just a broad idea about exactly what it is, strengthening local planning capacity, and that could happen in a number of different ways. I mean, we've heard that one roadblock for solar right now is municipalities understanding how to welcome solar into their town, and the way that relates specifically to the work of this group is the idea of some help, you know, particularly at DACF for technical assistance as it relates to the intersection of solar and ag. You know, but that help could come in a number of different ways. And so we just named 2, again, you know, more staff assistance within state government, you know, particularly at DACF, that feels like a really good fit. But then there could be, you know, grants to, you know, at the county level to the COGS or some other planning entity to help folks take this idea of dual use of the intersection of solar and ag and actually execute on that idea.
Yeah. So I would imagine, I'm guessing that it's hard for anybody to like object to this idea. The question, I think, becomes like, how important is it relative to other things? And Selena, I think Selena and I spoke briefly before the meeting a few days ago, and I think you mentioned that GEO is also taking a look at this issue, and I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to add on that.
Yeah, I think that Eliza's point about DACF's expertise is a good one. I'd also just note that GEO is looking holistically at how best, given our existing resources, to support municipalities when it comes to solar, renewable energy, and climate. And so being coordinated on the state side to support municipalities effectively on all of these would be just my note to say that we should all be working together to make it easy for communities.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, it's helpful. Any other reactions to that before we move on? Okay. In lieu fee, who covered that one?
This was mine. So this concept came up in our discussion of the example in New York, where essentially in submitting a permitting plan, developers in New York have to sort of provide information about the steps that they're taking to sort of minimize or remediate impacts to important resources, which include agricultural resources, as well as some other natural resources, as well as impacts to conserved land and open spaces. And then through the process, awarded projects could be responsible for making an agricultural mitigation payment to a designated fund, which is basically based on the extent to which the project is overlapping with those important soils or resources. And we just noted that those fees could be sort of, if we were going to use it in Maine, could be sort of tiered to reflect some of the categories that we provided in that other matrix. In terms of both dual use and co-location, I mean, those types of projects could be encouraged through basically the reduction or elimination of that type of a mitigation fee for those types of projects. But we did note that the scale of the project could be a factor here because it could sort of relate to the scope of the impact, and therefore it could, if it's a larger scale project with more sort of impact, the mitigation fund payment could be larger. We did note that this was a tool that, although interesting to explore, is probably one of the tools where more research is needed, both to determine sort of two categories. First, what sort of fee structure would really guide outcomes that are in accordance with some of the categories that we presented in the other matrix. And then on the flip side, how much money would really be needed to be able to use the funds within the mitigation fund for the purposes that it's traditionally used for, whether it's transmission upgrade or interconnection upgrades like Caitlin was talking about, or whether you would use the fund to then protect farmland in other parts of the state. And so we would probably need to do some economic analysis with respect to both of those categories to be able to see how this would function, or at least be able to implement it in Maine.
Great. And I did want to just point out, have you turn briefly to page 34, where we got a little bit further feedback from NYSERDA that in terms of the mitigation fund in New York, they haven't yet established the criteria that guides the allocation of the funds. Payments to the fund aren't provided until a project reaches commercial operation. And there has been an agricultural technical work group that's been established to come up with potential criteria and guidance on how that fund would be administered with input from the Department of Ag. Go ahead, Caitlin.
I just wanted to make a quick clarification. My team let me know that developers in Maine are already required to pay in lieu compensation fees specifically for wetland and habitat impacts. But I think what we're talking about here is expanding that to kind of all of the categories of agricultural land and other land uses that we're talking about in this group. But just wanted to make that clarification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gut reactions to this? Anything at all? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm a little reticent for us to be structuring something based upon a New York program, which doesn't quite exist yet, at least according to the email exchange I saw. So if we're going to model something, I think it would make sense for us to at least wait and see if it works, as opposed to jumping in and saying, great, let's replicate what New York does, as they're in the midst of figuring it out.
Got it. Thank you. Anything else before we move on? All right. Then dual use pilot project. Who covered that?
That's me.
Go ahead, Emily.
So a little bit similar to the comment you just made, Jeremy. This was just put through in New Jersey, and they have put through this 300 megawatt pilot, total projects up to 10 megawatts. And it's going to be, part of that is research done by Rutgers, but there's a lot of spaces to define and fill out in terms of what that is going to look like in New Jersey. They haven't successfully, well, not haven't successfully, they haven't actually defined the guidelines around this yet, but they have put this carve out and say there's going to be 300 megawatts of dual use. And so this is providing an opportunity for fixed length, sort of a maximum capacity. There's a potential to expand it, but it's really meant to be an opportunity for different projects that will fit underneath what is ultimately defined as dual use in New Jersey to get on the ground, to be studied through Rutgers is leading the way. You see the note around the public university. And it's meant to be rather interesting in the things that they're going to look at. So they're going to look at tiered adders around different costs. They're going to be looking at a variety of the crop impacts. And then obviously once they define what dual use those guidelines are, there'll be varying project designs within that. So, this is an opportunity for, in this case, New Jersey, to have a short-term pilot to gather all of this data that is going to be New Jersey specific around what works there. And it's an opportunity to, I think, really customize dual use in a specific state. So I think there's an opportunity here for Maine to follow something similar. I think University of Maine is already sort of involved with some projects, looking at some research around compatibility and to expand that. Not just having the university research, but having that expansion of projects initially to look at and then pause to evaluate before it becomes sort of a permanent part of the solar project designs in Maine.
So just reminding us all of the conversation that was just had about this in regards to the matrix, I think what I was hearing was some enthusiasm, maybe that's too strong, but I'll just use it for now, over the idea of a dual use pilot program, but certainly focused in part on agronomic issues, but equally on economic issues of how, if dual use is going to become, encouraged by any entity, how do we have to make sure that the economics support it, and that solar producers, solar developers can actually afford to do projects like that. So am I understanding correctly you know, the interest level and also one of the major areas of focus. Let me take Jeremy first. Let me take Jeremy. Go ahead.
Well, if Emily wanted to answer that, I'm happy to wait. I don't know.
I mean, I think it was sort of a question to all of you, you know, of just what I
okay.
was hearing for the last conversation, and just to, yeah, go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is, as Selena can probably attest, I'm a big fan of pilots, particularly when we're a small state. And to Matt's point earlier, Massachusetts does a lot of things because they have a gigantic number of ratepayers and sort of perpetual or seemingly incessant commercial investment, and Maine doesn't. So if we get things wrong, they go away for a decade or a generation. So I actually think sort of proof of concept that dual use can work. It provides value. It allows ecological and agricultural growth to continue, or however we want to define it, I think makes good sense. And I think it also addresses some of the things that I've sort of continually raised throughout this process, is the political realities that exist, which is that there is this perception that solar on greenfield, which would seemingly be the cheapest, is already too pricey. So if we were to pursue dual use aggressively, I think a small, narrow pilot program to assess those costs, figure out what does a developer need in order for it to be profitable, and then ultimately what could the ratepayer or taxpayer support be needed to make those projects a reality, would be really helpful. I think it would just sort of answer the unanswerable question, which is, what does it cost to do dual use in Maine currently?
Mm-hmm.
I really wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of urgency around getting moving, getting projects on the ground, but we're talking about 20 plus years of probably steady solar growth, right? Trying to meet some 2050 goals, and 3 to 5 years around a pilot to put projects on the ground. To have that space to get dual use in Maine and evaluated, I think personally, I think it's a really strong opportunity to move this forward, but do it in a fashion that is metered and measured and evaluated.
Got it. I didn't say, I think it was Selena and then Ellen, not quite sure.
Ellen first.
Okay, go ahead. Thanks.
I agree with everything that's been said so far about a pilot. I also just wanted to add that I think another benefit is that it also allows the department to figure out sort of what the right requirements are for this type of project. Obviously, we put forward sort of the best definition that we could, but I think having sort of some sort of program in place where the sort of boundaries and requirements associated with a dual use project on the agricultural side could also be sort of explored and better defined.
Great, thank you. Selena.
I'd be curious, not now, but perhaps in the next iteration of this recommendation, to see how to best support the University of Maine, or what specific pieces on the research side are needed to stand up the appropriate place to do this type of work in the state, and whether it already exists, or how to shape that in terms of the research component of any sort of pilot.
Okay. All right, I'm going to take that as a pretty strong endorsement for the moment, so that we can move on. I'm sorry, you go ahead, Nick, you go ahead. You're on mute.
Sorry, just building on what Selena was saying on the economics and the viability on the farmer side, on the agricultural enterprise. I think a pilot, which I completely agree with as well, would help identify what infrastructure, what's lacking for the farmer to have a successful enterprise. Totally get that we need to do it for the developer too, and for the communities and for the state, but also to see what farmers require to breathe life into those sites as they.
Yeah, got it. Okay, great. I'm going to do a time check here. I definitely built time into the agenda for, I think, more time than we need for one of the remaining agenda items. I do think that this is a useful exercise. I'm wondering if you disagree with that. Please speak up, but my instinct would be to take a break for a moment, see if we have public comment. From that, move on to an actual break so you can get up and stand up, and then come back and finish the rest of this list. It will leave less time for the remaining agenda items, but I think we're okay on that. Is that all okay with you? Okay, so let's just see if there are not a lot of public members on this call, but of the 6 or so of you, if you have anything that you'd like to share at this point, if you could just raise your hand and we'll take you. Okay, go ahead, Jason. Is he able to unmute himself? We're working on it. We're working on it. Ethan, can he? Is he able to?
I just promoted him to the panelist, so it'll take a minute or a couple of seconds for him to switch over here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. No, I just wanted to comment on
Tell
the
us who
hosting
you are.
capacity. So Jason Rao, I'm with Central Maine Power. I'm the Energy Environment Regulatory Policy Manager. And I just wanted to comment on the hosting capacity maps. You know, in that area, that was actually also a recommendation that came out of the Maine Utility Regulatory Reform and Decarbonization Initiative, which ran over the winter, this past winter. That was an stakeholder effort that was funded by the Nature Conservancy to look at opportunities for the utilities to contribute to decarbonization, what we could do. So that was a joint effort amongst utilities and many other stakeholders. So that is something that at CMP we're looking into developing.
Great, thank you. Good to know. And anyone else? Okay, all right. Well, then why don't we take a break? It's 10:48 by my computer. What if we came back at in 7 minutes at 10:55? Does that work? All right, see you then. Hello, Patrick. You get the prompt award. Oh, followed by a close second.
My high school homeroom teacher would be astonished.
All right, we've lost Matt. He has to drop off for an 11 a.m. call. Thanks for the productive discussion. Have a great weekend. I'm not going to pay attention to who has joined. I'm going to start us back on time. We did see a note from Nancy, you'll recall, if she's not able to come back, if she misses the discussion regarding addressing stormwater concerns for grazing, as indicated in the table, this is happening. So we were at Tara program, am I right? Yeah, okay, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, this one is me as well. And this one is collected looking at the Mass Smart program, but there are others, there's Vermont, and basically thinking about how this would encourage or discourage dual use is around that financial incentive to site in dual use. The sort of information that needs to be understood better is what does that adder need to be in terms of added costs to the project, but also in terms of all of the other aspects of this, and then what would that impact be on a ratepayer. So there's a lot of unknowns around the economics of what that would look like for Maine. On the other side of this, there is the potential for a subtractor. So instead of the carrot, the stick, the subtractor to de-incentivize siting unless it's in the locations that are preferred, or unless it's dual use. And so there are two sides to that coin, and certainly they provide different economic issues that would need to be researched and better understood. If there's significant of enough of an adder, or perhaps significant of enough of a subtractor, then I think you can see potential for siting to be reevaluated. If it's not big enough of an adder or subtractor, then that might not be a deterrent. And so there's just a lot of unknowns, I think, around what that would look like. And I know that that's the adder and subtractor thing is often perhaps the most debated way to go about this, or the concerning way to go about this in terms of the economics. So, but it has worked in Massachusetts because it's twofold, right? There's an adder, but then there's also siting regulations where it cannot be on farmland unless it's dual use. So, how it's working in Massachusetts is a two-piece thing, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other explanation that's needed about what you're seeing on this page? And then we can open it up for quick comment. Okay, reactions to this? Yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, so I'm more enthusiastic about adders than subtractors. I don't want to be putting up roadblocks to solar development. The analogy I'll use is you have a little stream and you throw a big rock in it, you can change where the water goes. So same thing with solar development. Like maybe our group should be, kind of putting a boulder in there so that the solar development goes the direction we want, but we don't want to put up any dams because then you wind up with less solar downstream.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other reactions to it, if there are major concerns, I think it's better to voice them so that there can be a discussion about them than just sort of quiet reticence. Emily, go ahead.
I agree. These are the two sides of the coin. I find that I see the adder with the added financial being a more likely route to actually move that forward, because a subtractor you know, that you're reducing basically the net profit for a project that's going to require more costs to develop. So I sort of see that as basically a route that's really not going to move forward very much. So in terms of these two options, I think that if there's one that we want to investigate and encourage more research around, the adder is probably the one of these two that would need investigation, in my opinion.
Thank you. Selena.
I like the way Emily put that. And I think I feel like I'm not quite to the point of wanting to say, yes, definitely we need an adder today. And so some sort of forward-looking process for that might be an appropriate way. And then I often struggle with, I know our group is tasked with looking at the intersection between agriculture and solar, but when you're thinking about adders, I think a broader perspective about how to balance, I mean, as I've talked about this many times, but just where does dual use or ag incentives balance out with other adders that other groups and people are interested in. So I struggle with that, but definitely open to the conversation around having that down the road.
Okay, and I'm seeing a lot of endorsement of that. Focus on further investigation of adders and potentially moving forward with a recommendation for another process to dig into that further. Anything else that needs to be said now on this one? Okay, then allowing dual use projects to remain in current use taxation. I will just remind you all to take a look at also page 39 that, or just reflect on Rebecca Graham's presentation from the last meeting, expressing her concerns about this. So with that in mind.
So I covered this tool. And so this would basically just allow farmland that's currently enrolled in the farmland current use taxation program that is housing a dual use project to not be subject to the withdrawal penalty, as long as the farming operation is able to meet the requirements for the farmland current use taxation program. And then I just also noted there could also be a similar carve out or a separate carve out, or we could go with this instead, for smaller solar projects that are primarily used to create energy for on-farm use. And that's sort of an example that comes from Vermont. But essentially in both cases, the solar array is treated as part of the agricultural infrastructure or equipment. So the presence of it, as long as the other farmland current use taxation requirements are being met, does not trigger, the presence of the solar project does not trigger the withdrawal penalty. And so this could obviously encourage dual use projects because removing that added cost of the withdrawal penalty is a savings for developers who want to put those types of projects on land that's enrolled. And then you could also think about, and then obviously that is beneficial for all of the areas where, at least now in the matrix, we're sort of saying that we want to encourage dual use projects. And I just noted that there is sort of a size consideration here, because obviously the larger, the number of acres impacted, right? Or so the number of acres within the solar project footprint is tied to the withdrawal penalty. So it's obviously more of an economic incentive for projects that cover many acres, for which the withdrawal penalty would be higher. If it's a smaller project on a smaller number of acres, then the withdrawal penalty might not be a big deal. And so it might not be that much of an economic incentive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'll stop there. That's basically the gist of it.
Okay, so reactions to this one. Caitlin.
I was just going to say, from the development perspective, this one could have a huge impact just in standardizing how dual use projects can be treated. It's kind of an opportunity to create a statewide like standard outside of any like specific dual use program. Just having like this guidance of this is how these projects are going to be treated gives developers like a lot of certainty and incentive to pursue these types of projects.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Other thoughts, particularly I think from developers on this one? Nick, you go ahead.
I want to believe from the farmer perspective that if there's a way on the small scale to not be penalized to try to add some viability to the farming enterprise. So for some on-farm use of solar, I would not want to be penalized for, trying to access some of those marginal lands I was talking about before. If there was a way to develop a ground mount site that was an acre or something small that had added benefit to, the farm enterprise, I wouldn't want to be penalized for that. And I see that, those arrays that are directing energy to the enterprise are in some cases considered, not to be penalized or suggested they will be penalized. So I guess I'm just in favor of those smaller scale programs that are arrays that are somehow adding to the viability of it versus massive development. So yeah.
Great, thank you. George.
So behind the meter is kind of different than what we've been talking about so far. And I realize that quote unquote small might not be behind the meter, but I am worried from the development side that we're going from talking about, project development that has public utility implications to project development that's a little bit different because it's potentially behind the meter. So I think my focus in this particular item in the matrix is that it's really, really important to find a way to avoid creating a new exemption, which triggers constitutional mandates for the state to pay back a municipality 50% of the missing value. And I also think it's a really, keeping in mind MMA's point, it's a really good idea to find a way to treat this as agricultural equipment. I feel very strongly that dual use solar is in fact agricultural equipment, and it's reasonable to treat it as agricultural equipment, even if that dual use application does in fact produce more power than what the farm is using directly in of itself. Again, this is in front of the meter, not a behind the meter type of application. So I think that's one way to do this. And I think that, again, dual use or something, even putting solar, quote unquote, dual use in an area where there's cover crops, I think that's a very reasonable compromise, especially when you have cover crops that are marginal, or you have really significant grazing. But I realize that grazing right now is also occurring in certain places where we're talking about farmland or land that hasn't been farmed at all, and now we're suddenly grazing on it. So this is kind of one of the interesting situations about this entire discussion of dual use and current use taxation, which is, depending on how we handle this has a potential to increase farming, because farming will be seen as a way to get tax preferential treatment for solar and energy development. And I like both of those things. I think that's a good thing. I don't really see a lot of liability to the taxpayer if it's handled properly. And primarily the transition from tree growth to current use seems to be the taxation challenge. So I'm just gonna throw all that out there. I am a little concerned about any discussions about behind the meter and on farm. That actually could be, we could go way off track getting into that stuff, but I respect the fact that that the farmers want to talk about that. But I mean, I would encourage treating that as some kind of current use as well.
Thank you. Ellen.
Sorry, I realized I wanted to add that when we were doing this tool, we did look at the example in Rhode Island, but decided not to include a similar structure because in Rhode Island, there's an allowance for an exemption from the withdrawal penalty for any type of solar project, as long as it's under like a certain size limitation. And that seemed to us like it wouldn't really be able to fit with our sort of constitutional requirements related to farmland current use taxation. And again, I wanted to sort of, emphasize what George was saying. I mean, to us, this seemed like if you have a true dual use project, as long as the farmland current use taxation programs related to farming are being maintained, then really this is just sort of part of the farm infrastructure and not deviating from sort of the purpose of the farmland current use taxation program.
So I'm going to suggest we move on, and we can just wait to see, based on the three policy ideas that each of you write in the chat at the end, how much this resonates or not to keep pursuing. And I think I'm not clear whether we should be skipping over the next one, addressing stormwater concerns for grazing, because it's like fully covered based on Nancy, your note in the chat, or if there's something more that needs to be discussed there. Who researched this one?
I had filled this in based on our team's discussion with Nancy, so happy to hand it over to you if you want to discuss it. I just thought it was important to have this on the list since it is one of the tools that would encourage different siting, but just wanted to note that it is happening. We don't really have to do anything as this group.
Okay, all right. Agreement on that, Nancy? Yeah, okay. All right, thanks. So who covered participation of DACF?
That was also me.
Okay.
And so this was just sort of following the structure in Vermont where basically the Ag Department, DACF here in Maine, would receive notice about proposed projects that impact certain agricultural resources. And then if you were following the structure in Vermont, there's both sort of the right or the obligation in certain instances for DACF to appear at the PUC hearings. And that sort of, the difference between the sort of right and the obligation was based on the size of the proposed project. And I provided a little bit of information below. So, I mean, how it would affect dual use and co-location is essentially, DACF could, if they felt like it made sense, could be providing additional support for those types of projects through their participation. But I mean, that's sort of, it's not a huge game changer in terms of cost or anything like that. But I did want to note that that was something that we had sort of gone over within the context of Vermont, was that their Department of Ag sort of does play a role when certain agricultural resources are at stake.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Concerns or enthusiasm about this? Nancy, go ahead.
Thanks for putting this in the matrix. And I think this just goes to the larger point of more focused departmental, whether it's Department of Ag or Department of Environmental Protection or wherever, more attentive state resources to solar, generally speaking. I don't see that as a bad thing. With Vermont, I recall that although their agency received notice and was able to weigh in, their PUC didn't necessarily, it appeared, have mechanisms in place to make adjustments. I might be misremembering, but I guess the bigger point is, what is the impact of our participation? I see a benefit of us being very plugged in, very aware, data gathering, understanding the current universe of potential development on agricultural land, and that's something that I would definitely support. But I guess the other half of the coin what is the impact? And so for further consideration.
Okay, other thoughts on this one? All right, so then we're at the end of the list. Oh, you go ahead.
Jody, can I just weigh in really quick? I was just looking over, you know, the first 4 words are DACF could provide support for those second, third, and fourth columns. I'm not sure I'm aware of any state agency that would ever actively support an application. That would be really unusual. So to me, I mean, just to be totally realistic, I think really what we're talking about here is if we ask DACF to be involved in solar permitting, they're more likely going to be saying negative things than positive things. Like I'm just thinking about like the way IF&W involves itself in the DEP reviews of solar or wind or whatever it is. They say, you know, look, there's too many bats or too many birds, it doesn't work. I've never read IF&W comments to say, fantastic site selection, we fully support it. So just to be sort of realistic, I don't think we're going to see a regulatory agency giving a thumbs up to a project. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you. Ellen, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do wonder though if, you know, because as we've seen even within our own conversations, right, the concept of dual use is a little bit amorphous. And I do wonder if, particularly through the pilot or some other processes that get underway, if DACF could be weighing in though about whether they feel like the proposed project is meeting sort of whatever requirements are developed with respect to, or could provide some input with respect to the impact to the agricultural resources, that sort of thing.
Then I think with that, let me give you all a few minutes to look quickly over this list of 9 pages and jot down in the chat. There's 11 of you on the call. It'd be great to get, you know, 3 lines from each of you of the 3 policies that you feel like are worthy of further consideration, or worthy of putting more meat on the bones. Don't be influenced by your fellow members. We'll collate all this and get it back to you in consolidated form. Five of you have weighed in, I think, so far. 6. 7, 8, 9. I think there may be 2 more of you, if I was counting right. Anybody not done? Yeah, Liza. Let's see. Caitlin's cheating. Okay, do we have everybody? Anybody not finished? Emily's not finished. Okay, we'll give you 1 more minute and then we'll move on. And we will be moving on to scorecards. And so if you could turn to, pages starting on, sorry, I've got a mess here going. You know, it's page 18, and it started with the Clean Energy States Alliance document. I think for background information, we have Tom Gordon to thank for putting together page 27, which is a comparative of the attributes in 5 states' scorecards. And so I just sort of wanted to open it up for further comment. I'm not looking in the chat to see how many of you may have identified a scorecard concept. Did anybody of you identify a scorecard concept as of interest? Okay, Eliza.
But can I add to that?
Please.
Judy, not a scorecard concept that's specific to pollinator or vegetation management, but many of the policy tools that we talked about had a scorecard element to them.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I'm totally open to how to, you know, manage this conversation. I really just wanted to make sure that you all had full access to how other states are implementing this concept, get your general reaction to whether you think it has logical applicability to Maine. And if you cross that threshold with a yes, then we could dig into the elements that appear to be kind of the most common amongst scorecards from other states. So let me open it up just to your feedback on this concept for use in Maine. Go ahead, George.
Who's the intended user of the scoring system? Like, what's the, I guess that's my biggest question right now. Who's using it and how?
So all of you weigh in. I'm no expert here. Are you looking for an answer now for people who understand it, or you're sort of skeptical of the resource because you don't? Yeah.
Look, not necessarily skeptical, just trying to understand what the group thinking is, so where this should be used, when, what step in the process, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I can offer up, as at the risk of being a person who talks too much. As far as applications in other states, page 22 describes those. You know, speaking on behalf of Maine Audubon, we're very enthusiastic about specific vegetation management practices, and particularly planting native plants, plants that support pollinator species, et cetera. You know, we're working right now with developers and horticulturalists on putting together a Maine specific guide on this. In my opinion, though, these things do not operate alone. That if you are planting vegetation that supports pollinators, that land is still not in agricultural development, or arguably is not in agricultural development. So it might not be, it's not necessarily achieving, I think, the purpose of this group. However, I can imagine the idea of incorporating vegetation management principles into a much broader scoring system. So it could be applicable to, or a broader project evaluation proposal. So it could be potentially incorporated in a PBR, could be incorporated into a tariff program, into a PUC evaluation process. But I think, as in addition to concepts related to dual use and co-location and land use considerations, that in my estimation, it shouldn't be stand alone.
I did want to raise sort of a, you go ahead.
For Eliza, when you talk about, are you differentiating on pollinators between wild pollinators versus, you know, commercial beekeeping, because those are, you know, there's some rather interesting, I mean, commercial beekeeping is clearly agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair distinction, obviously.
Slightly tangential, but I do feel like it's related here. We did receive just a couple of days ago an email from an individual who is associated with a statewide program called Ag Allies that strives to protect grassland birds while still supporting dairy farmers and other landowners, and just wanted to note the grassland bird population decline in Maine. It's a group of birds that are declining faster than any other group of birds, and that preserving their habitat when possible is critical. And so I just, you know, wondered whether, although these scorecards focus exclusively on pollinator issues, I think many of the considerations would positively impact that resource as well. You go ahead, Nick.
And is the task here that we're trying to consider whether we want to create one or use them as the tool? Because I think some those two things, what you just shared, that email, and then previously what Eliza said, these are very good points, that there's sort of more to, and George too, there's more to the habitat, the vegetation, and these sites than just pollinator habitat. There's nesting bird habitat. There are grazable forages that include species that are forages for pollinators as well as grazing animals. So and then you could develop scorecards that are looking at farmer accessibility to the sites to make them usable for the expansion eventually of dual use. You know, how are they accessible not only to wild and livestock and to humans? So there's all kinds of different ways you could look at a scorecard. Those that have been shared here, I think, are compelling, but perhaps incomplete for what might be developed in Maine.
From a developer's standpoint, I'd be interested in Caitlin, your and Jeremy, your perspective on how these scorecards are used in other states and whether you think that they can be helpful because you can, you know, promote a project as being pollinator friendly, or whether it's seen as a whole bunch of additional hurdles that you'd like the freedom to be able to do things somewhat, you know, without these specific constraints while still, you know, citing responsibly.
Yeah, just briefly, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a scorecard. I think it's a great tool to just like get everyone on the same page about what's expected and, you know, the best practices. I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around like what this group's goal with the scorecard is, and maybe it makes more sense once we've kind of determined the other tools that we want to recommend. Like, how would a scorecard element fit into those if necessary? I don't know. I don't know how we would just recommend a scorecard kind of on its own in a vacuum as this group. Yeah.
Would it be helpful? I'm just sort of grasping here, thinking aloud, which is never a good idea, but would it be helpful to send this back to the policy subgroup to say to add this as a tool amongst all of the others into that table, to do a little bit, you know, to articulate a little bit more clearly or more succinctly how this tool could, to follow the matrix, to follow the organization of the table, either encourage dual use or encourage co-location, or and whether it has, you know, project size implications or not, and how to implement it. I think most specifically, what would be the way in which it would be used. Would it be helpful to do that, or to fully put this aside until there's further discussion about the priority policies that you've articulated in the chat?
For me, I'd rather set it aside. I think I kind of echo what Caitlin was saying. I'm just not sure how this is going to work until we get a little further into it. I mean, I don't strenuously object if you want to send it back to the policy subgroup, but I'd rather set it aside personally.
Mm-hmm. Anybody feel, go ahead, Nancy.
I'm also sort of struck by that this isn't necessarily a solar specific topic. While there's certainly application within the solar development realm for pollinator protective activities, pollinator protective activities in all types of construction and development, I think are worthy goals. And so I'm just wondering if, I think Eliza even mentioned it earlier, whether there's potential contemplation for adding pollinator protective activities or scrutiny within other existing permitting structures, such as the site location or the Natural Resources Development Protection Act, NRPA. So anyway, just a thought.
All right, then I think what I'm hearing is we put it aside for now. We potentially bring it back up maybe 2 meetings from now, see if it feels relevant at that point after you've made more progress on your priority policy areas. How's that sound? Okay. All right. Then great. Moving along then to the next agenda item is the consensus areas document. And so I've just made such a mess of this meeting packet. Let's get to that point, which is page 30. Sorry. Tell me what page it is.
I think it's 32.
32.
Thank you. Not good form there. So you will see that we're attempting to, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, for the next meeting, we would like to have an initial framework, a skeleton of a draft report to you at the same time that you're still working substantively on the content of the report. It will include some, you know, a definition section. It will include, you know, kind of a chronology of the issues that you covered, who's on this committee. Ideally, some kind of consensus consensus areas that then get further translated into specific policy recommendations. And so that's the piece that you're continuing to work on. But at this level, that sort of is the precursor to the specific recommendations. That's kind of what the purpose of this document is, as a placeholder for your for the points that we think you've agreed on so far. So again, there weren't an enormous number of changes between the last meeting and this one, but the ones that were added were in bold. And so we just wanted to make sure that you felt that these additions were reflective of your discussion last month. I believe some of you did submit feedback on the technical guidance document already, and the department has received that. George, go ahead.
Partly my fault. I think I missed good chunk of last meeting, but that first bullet, which says that prime farmland and soils of statewide importance are key to, and then it says a couple things, but it's key to biodiversity. I'm not actually sure that's true. I think that habitat is key to biodiversity, but I'm not entirely sure that farmland and soils are in of themselves universally important to biodiversity. I think habitat always is, and you have certain types of habitat that might develop on those soils, but I actually think saying that prime farmland and soils of statewide importance in a broad brush stroke are always supporting biodiversity, I'm not actually sure that's true. And then the only other thing I think that might be worth adding in here at some point is their initial mandate for the group had mentioned a lot about working forests, and we really haven't talked about that. And I just sort of think the updated consensus should sort of just say, look, we haven't gotten into working forests. We've really been focused on farms. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we haven't really discussed that in depth, and we may not get to that. I'm fine with it. I just think it's important for the group's outcomes to be clear on that.
Thank you. Emily.
Thanks. I just want to follow up with George's soil point, and maybe I'm biased being a soil scientist. It's not necessarily that it's prime important that will support biodiversity, but the healthy soils and improving soil health across the board and protecting what soils we have that are already in good health in terms of that piece of biodiversity, and soil biodiversity itself is a part. And so it's sort of the fact that the soils have a key part in the habitat health as well.
You're breaking up a little bit, but I think we heard the bulk of your feedback on that. I think my instinct is that this is going to be sort of more useful for you to react to once it's embedded in a different form in a draft document. So I'm happy to continue conversation on any other substantive areas of concern, but I also think that in this form, it may be a little bit difficult to have a whole lot of conversation about it without seeing kind of how it fits into a report form. Any other thoughts on that at the moment? Okay, then, and very much open to further public comment, but we only have a few members left on the line. So feel free to raise your hand if you'd like. So where I think we're at, and we'll be able to end early, is the planning team is going to reconvene at 1 o'clock. We'll be talking about this idea of bringing in a speaker on dual use. We will be collating from the chat your priority areas, reflecting that back to you, figuring out what further work could be done between now and the next meeting on those specific policy areas. And we will likely follow up with you and perhaps request your involvement, whether it's this policy tools subgroup and sort of task your subgroup with digging into them further. If you're open to doing that, I think that may be the most logical way to continue to make progress on it. And we'll also be having edits made by Caitlin, your subgroup, on the matrix. And what else am I missing? Okay, so our next meeting is on October 21st. You'll receive a packet of information 1 week prior on the 14th, in order to respectfully give the chairs a little bit more time to review the meeting packet before it actually goes out to all of you. If I could just make a note to maybe you, Ellen, and you, Caitlin, that I'll probably be requesting further information from your subgroups by the 11th, rather than by the, right at the 14th. So if you could have that date on your calendar, and then I'll follow up with both of you after this meeting, or if not me, then Tom Gordon will. Anything else? Yeah, Liza.
I think it'd be helpful when you convene the planning meeting. I'm interested in thoughts on how this group can be helpful to the distributed generation or net energy billing stakeholder group that's going to start convening soon. I know that siting is an element of the work that they're going to be doing, and of among many things that stakeholder group needs to focus on. And I can't help but think that we can be helpful in some way, and I'd love to think about, or folks to think about, what that might look like.
Great. We can certainly circle back to that at 1 o'clock for initial thoughts. Good. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for sticking with it, and we'll be in touch very soon. Okay. See ya.